A mountain man saved 2 black boys, but what their mother did the next day stunned everyone. Snow still covered the high pass when he carried those children out of the storm, half frozen, praying they'd live till morning. Down in the valley, the townsfolk whispered, "Why would a white trapper risk his life for strangers no one else would touch?" Then, in the muddy street, their mother saw them, and the whole town stopped cold. She fell to her knees, kissed the mountain man's frost-bitten hands, and called him brother. The sheriff didn't like that, neither did the miners. By sundown, the man who saved 2 lives was marked as an outcast. But when fire swept through the town and smoke blackened the sky, the truth they tried to bury came roaring back, a truth that could break the town's pride in half. Why did this mother risk everything for the man they hated? And when mercy and prejudice finally met face to face, which would the town choose? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through the bitter wind and stinging sleet, Jameson Boone tracked the wounded elk's trail. Blood spots dotted the fresh snow like dark berries, leading higher into the pass. His old mule Granger plodded behind, head low against the storm. The late spring weather had turned treacherous fast, as mountain weather often did. Boone pulled his worn buffalo coat tighter. The familiar weight of solitude settled over him like the gathering snow. 10 years he'd wandered these peaks alone, ever since that terrible day he'd returned to the mining camp to find Mary and their newborn son claimed by cholera. If he'd been there instead of out scouting for the army. But such thoughts led nowhere good. The wind howled through the pines, drowning out Granger's soft nickering. Wet snow plastered Boone's beard and stung his eyes as he studied the ground. The elk's tracks were growing fainter, covered by the fresh powder that swirled and danced in the gusts. "Reckon we ought to wait this out, old friend," he murmured to the mule. A rocky overhang ahead offered some shelter, its weathered face worn smooth by countless storms. Boone led Granger beneath it and set about gathering what dry kindling he could find. Soon, a small fire crackled, pushing back the worst of the cold. Boone heated coffee in his battered tin cup, letting the warmth seep into his stiff fingers. The flames cast dancing shadows on the rock wall behind him. In their movement, he sometimes imagined he saw Mary's face, her gentle smile that had once made his world complete. The isolation pressed in around him like a physical thing. Out here, a man could go weeks without speaking to another soul. Sometimes Boone wondered if he'd forgotten how. The mountains had become both his refuge and his prison, a place to hide from the guilt that still gnawed at him, but also a lonely exile of his own making. A sound carried on the wind, so faint he might have imagined it. Boone tilted his head, listening. There it came again, a cry, high and thin, almost lost in the storm's fury. His spine stiffened. That was no animal's call. Without hesitation, Boone kicked snow over the fire and mounted Granger. The mule's ears were pricked forward, sensing his urgency. They moved carefully through the whiteout conditions, Boone straining to catch that sound again. The slope grew steeper, treacherous with ice beneath the fresh snow. There, another cry, clearer now. Boone guided Granger toward it, the mule picking his way carefully around snow-covered boulders. Through the curtain of white, a dark shape gradually emerged, the broken form of an overturned wagon, its wheels spinning slowly in the wind. Boone's heart quickened. He dismounted and approached cautiously, snow crunching beneath his boots. The wagon had slid off the narrow track, tumbling partway down the slope before catching against a sturdy pine. Its canvas cover was torn, snapping in the wind like a wounded bird's wing. Near the creek at the bottom of the slope, he spotted something else. The still form of a man, face down in the half-frozen water. One hand still gripped the leather reins, frozen in that final desperate attempt to control the horses that were nowhere to be seen. Boone's chest tightened. He'd seen death enough times to know there was nothing to be done for the man. But that cry... He turned back to the wagon, hope and dread warring in his gut. Carefully, he pulled himself up to peer inside the tilted cargo bed. Two small forms huddled beneath a ragged quilt, clutching each other. Boys, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Their dark skin was ashen with cold, lips tinged blue. But they were alive, barely. The older boy's eyes fluttered open as Boone's shadow fell across them, filled with equal parts terror and desperate hope. "Help," the boy whispered through chattering teeth. "Please." Boone didn't hesitate. "I've got you, son," he said softly, reaching for them. "You're safe now." The younger boy was unconscious, his small body limp as Boone carefully lifted him. The older boy tried to hold on to his brother, but his frozen fingers couldn't maintain their grip. Boone's buffalo coat was off in an instant, wrapping it around both children. "Hang on tight," he told the older boy, as he gathered them both in his arms. The wind screamed around them as he made his way back to where Granger waited. The mule stood steady as a rock, while Boone mounted awkwardly, holding the precious bundle against his chest. They needed shelter, and fast. The overhang where he'd stopped earlier wouldn't be enough. The boys needed warmth and proper care if they were going to survive. Through the swirling snow, Boone oriented himself. His cabin was a good 4 miles away, but he knew these mountains like the back of his hand. They could make it. Granger seemed to sense the urgency of their mission. The sure-footed mule picked his way down the treacherous slope with careful determination. Boone kept the boys tucked inside his coat, trying to share what body heat he could. The older boy drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling something about their father. "I'm sorry about your pa," Boone said quietly, though he wasn't sure the boy could hear him. "But I'm going to look after you both now. That's a promise." The words surprised him even as he spoke them. How long had it been since he'd made a promise to anyone? The weight of responsibility settled over him, foreign but somehow right. These boys needed him. Perhaps this was why he'd been drawn to check that elk trail today, why he'd stopped to make camp when he did. Perhaps there was purpose in it all. The storm showed no signs of letting up as they made their slow way through the gathering dusk. Snow collected on Granger's mane and ears, but the mule plodded steadily onward. Boone's hands were numb on the reins, his shirt soaked through with melted snow, but the small bodies against his chest still held warmth. Faint, but there. Finally, the dark shape of his cabin emerged from the white haze. Boone had never been so glad to see the rough-hewn logs and smoke-blackened chimney. He dismounted carefully, keeping the boys cradled close as he shouldered open the door. The cabin was cold, the fire having died down to embers during his absence. Boone laid the boys gently on his narrow bed, keeping them wrapped in his buffalo coat. Working quickly, he built up the fire until flames roared in the stone fireplace. Then he heated water and found every blanket he owned. As warmth gradually filled the cabin, color began returning to the boys' faces. The older one woke first, eyes darting fearfully around the unfamiliar surroundings before finding Boone's face. Where are we?" he asked weakly. "My cabin," Boone answered, helping him sit up to sip some warm water. "You're safe here. What's your name, son?" "Marcus," the boy whispered. "That's my brother, Samuel." His eyes filled with tears. "Our pa." "I know," Boone said gently. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry." The boy's face crumpled, and Boone did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out and pulled the child into a careful embrace. Marcus stiffened for a moment, then melted against him, his slight frame shaking with silent sobs. Samuel stirred then, letting out a frightened whimper. Marcus immediately turned to his brother, taking his hand. "It's all right, Sam," he soothed. "This man helped us. We're safe." Boone watched the brothers cling to each other, and something long frozen inside him began to thaw. He'd spent so many years pushing away human connection, convinced he didn't deserve it after failing his own family. But watching these boys, their love for each other, their resilience in the face of tragedy, stirred something in his soul he'd thought long dead. The storm raged on outside. But inside, the cabin, a different kind of warmth was growing. As Boone tended to the boys, feeding them simple broth and checking them for frostbite, he felt the first stirrings of purpose he'd known in years. These children needed him. And maybe, just maybe, he needed them too. When both boys finally drifted into exhausted sleep, still holding hands beneath the pile of blankets, Boone sat in his chair by the fire and watched over them. The wind howled outside like a hungry wolf, but it couldn't touch them here. Tomorrow would bring hard decisions and harder conversations. The boys would need to be told about their father again when they were stronger. Arrangements would have to be made. But for now, they were safe. And for the first time in a very long time, Jameson Boone didn't feel alone. Night had fallen by the time Boone's cabin came into view through the whirling snow. Granger, his faithful mule, stumbled on the final approach, sides heaving with exhaustion. The boys lay motionless in Boone's arms, their breathing shallow beneath his buffalo coat. "Almost there," he muttered, as much to himself as to his charges. The cabin's dark outline loomed ahead, a simple structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. Boone had built it himself 8 years ago, choosing this sheltered spot beneath towering pines for its natural protection from the worst mountain storms. Dismounting was a challenge with his precious burden. His legs, stiff from hours in the saddle, nearly buckled as he slid down. The younger boy, Samuel, didn't stir at all during the movement. Marcus managed a weak whimper. Boone shouldered open the heavy wooden door, ducking through the low frame. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark, the morning's fire long dead. He laid the boys gently on his narrow bed, keeping them wrapped in his coat while he worked to bring warmth back to the space. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the tinderbox. The first spark caught the dried pine needles, and soon a small flame danced in the stone hearth. Boone added kindling, then larger logs, working methodically until the fire roared properly. The boys' wet clothes would kill them as surely as the cold if left on. Boone moved carefully but quickly, stripping off their sodden garments. Their skin was frighteningly cold to the touch. He wrapped them in dry deer hides, the softest he had, layering them with every blanket he owned. Samuel stirred slightly as Boone tucked the hides around him. "Mama," he mumbled, the word barely audible. Marcus remained silent, his face drawn with cold and shock. Boone's hands shook as he reached for his cooking pot. He needed to get something warm into them, and fast. Filling the pot with clean snow from outside, he set it near the fire to melt. While it heated, he crumbled some of his precious elk jerky into the water, creating a simple broth. As he worked, unwanted memories flooded back, memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Mary, his wife, moving about their small cabin in the mining camp, humming hymns as she worked, her quiet prayers each night before bed, the way she'd looked at him the morning he'd left to guide that hunting party, her hand resting protective over her swollen belly. "Come back safe," she'd said. But he was the one who'd come back to find them both gone, taken by the cholera that swept through the camp while he was away. The broth was ready. Boone lifted Marcus's head carefully, bringing a spoonful to his lips. "Drink, son," he urged softly. "Just a little." The boy managed a few sips before turning away. Samuel was harder. Boone had to massage his throat to get him to swallow. Between spoonfuls of broth, Boone found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He knelt beside the fire, hands clasped awkwardly, and tried to remember how to pray. "Lord," he whispered, voice rough with disuse, "I ain't talked to you in a long while. Reckon I ain't had the right. But these boys, they need your help. They're innocent. Don't let them pay for my mistakes." The words felt clumsy on his tongue, but something in his chest loosened as he spoke them. The night stretched endless before him. Every hour, Boone fed more logs to the fire, keeping the cabin as warm as he could. He checked the boys' breathing constantly, holding a mirror to their lips to catch the faint fog of life. Their hands and feet worried him most. Both showed signs of frostbite. He warmed water and bathed the affected areas gently, holding their cold fingers between his calloused palms until warmth slowly returned. Marcus woke briefly near midnight, disoriented and frightened. Boone spoke to him softly, helping him drink more broth, explaining where he was. The boy drifted back to sleep, holding his brother's hand. Samuel remained deeply unconscious, but his breathing had grown stronger. As Boone worked, he found himself humming one of Mary's old hymns. The melody came back slowly, like water seeping through long, dry ground. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." The words stuck in his throat, but the tune brought an odd comfort to the dark hours. He checked their feet again, relieved to find some color returning to the pale flesh. The frostbite wasn't as severe as he'd feared. Their faces, too, had lost that gray cast of near death. Still, Boone didn't let himself relax. He'd seen how quickly mountain cold could claim a life, how death could steal in like a thief in the night. Dawn came gradually, more sensed than seen through the cabin's single window. The storm's fury had spent itself sometime in the early hours, leaving behind that particular silence that follows heavy snow. Boone had just finished adding another log to the fire when he heard a weak voice from the bed. "You an angel?" It was Samuel, his dark eyes open and aware for the first time. Boone moved to sit beside him, helping him take a few sips of water. "No, son," he replied softly. "Just a man who was close enough to hear you." The boy's face crumpled slightly. "Our pa," he started, then stopped, tears welling up. "I know," Boone said gently. "I'm sorry, but you're safe now. Both of you." Marcus stirred then, awakening to find his brother conscious. The boys reached for each other immediately, drawing comfort from the familiar touch. Boone stepped back, giving them space to reunite, to grieve. As he watched them whisper to each other, checking that the other was truly alive, something shifted in Boone's chest. The familiar weight of guilt and grief was still there, but alongside it now burned something new. Or perhaps something very old, reawakened. Purpose, responsibility, and underneath it all, a flicker of faith he'd thought long extinguished. The morning light strengthened, seeping through the window in pale shafts. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world of pristine white. But the real transformation was happening inside the cabin, where a man who'd locked himself away from life was discovering that his heart hadn't forgotten how to care after all. Boone moved to add another log to the fire, his prayers continuing silently now. Not the polished prayers of his youth, but rough, honest words of gratitude. The boys were alive. They would need help, guidance, protection. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew with sudden certainty that God had led him to that wagon for a reason. For the first time in 10 years, Jameson Boone felt truly awake. Morning light filtered through the smoke hole in the cabin's roof, casting a pale beam across the rough-hewn floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white that reflected the sun's early rays. Inside, Jameson Boone stirred the embers of last night's fire, adding fresh kindling to chase away the dawn chill. A soft whimper from the bed caught his attention. Samuel, the younger boy, was beginning to wake, his face scrunching up as consciousness brought with it the memory of yesterday's tragedy. "Mama," he cried, tears already streaming down his cheeks. "I want Mama!" Isaac, who had been dozing fitfully beside his brother, sat up immediately. His thin arms wrapped around Samuel's shoulders, pulling him close in a practiced gesture of comfort. "Hush now, Samuel. We're safe. This man helped us." Boone moved quietly to the hearth, giving the boys space while keeping within sight. He'd learned long ago that sudden movements could startle injured creatures, human or animal. As he worked, he listened to Isaac's gentle murmuring, noting how the older boy seemed to carry a weight beyond his years. "Sir?" Isaac's voice was stronger now, though still rough from the cold. "Thank you for helping us. Our pa—" His voice caught, but he pressed on. "Our pa was taking us to Ouray. He'd found work in the mines there." Boone nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for his cooking pot. "Reckon you boys could use some hot food. Got some oats here. Make a fare? Porridge." While he worked, Isaac continued their story, his words tumbling out as if he needed to make sense of it all. "We were following the old stage road, but the storm came up so fast. Mama was worried about the bridge. It didn't look right. She went ahead on foot to check it, told Pa to wait." His voice trembled. "The whole thing just gave way. We heard it crack, and then—" Samuel buried his face in his brother's shoulder, shoulders shaking with fresh sobs. Boone stirred the porridge carefully, adding a precious spoonful of honey he'd been saving. The sweet smell filled the cabin, offering a small comfort. "Your mama?" Boone said carefully. "What's her name?" "Millie Carter," Isaac replied. "She's a laundress, the best one. She can get any stain out, and her pressing is perfect. Everyone in Fort Garland said so." Boone ladled the hot porridge into 2 tin bowls, his mind working. If the woman had gone ahead on foot, there was a good chance she'd survived. The bridge collapse would have stopped her from returning to the wagon, but she might have made it to one of the settlements down the valley. "She sings hymns while she works," Samuel offered suddenly, his tear-stained face emerging from Isaac's shoulder. "And she makes medicine from plants. She learned from Miss Sarah at the freedmen's camp." Boone handed them the bowls, along with 2 battered spoons. "Eat up now. Food'll help you think clearer." He watched as they dug in, hunger temporarily overwhelming grief. The porridge was simple fare, but hot and filling, exactly what they needed. While the boys ate, Boone pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside. The morning air bit sharp and clean, the storm's fury transformed into crystalline beauty. But beauty could kill in these mountains, and the melting snow would make the passes treacherous. He made his way to where he'd tethered Granger, checking on the mule and gathering his tools. The dead man would need burying before they could go anywhere. It wasn't right to leave him for the scavengers, no matter what color his skin. When he returned to the cabin, the boys had finished eating. Isaac was helping Samuel put on his dried clothes, his movements careful and protective. Boone cleared his throat softly. "Your pa," he said. "He needs proper burying. I aim to do that now, if you want to say goodbye." The boys nodded solemnly. Boone helped them bundle up in some of his spare clothes, too big but warm enough, and they made their way to where their father's body lay, now covered in fresh snow. Building a cairn was slow work. The ground was too frozen for digging, but Boone knew how to stack rocks to keep predators away. As he worked, the boys gathered smaller stones, adding them carefully to the growing mound. Samuel hummed broken pieces of hymns under his breath, while Isaac stood straight-backed and silent, trying to be strong. When the cairn was complete, Boone removed his hat. The prayer came easier this time, though his voice was still rough. "Lord, receive your servant. Guide him home to glory, and watch over those he's left behind." He paused, then added, "Amen." "Amen," the boys echoed softly. Back in the cabin, Boone began preparations for the journey ahead. The snow would start melting soon, making the mountain trails slick and dangerous. They needed to be ready to move as soon as conditions allowed. He pulled out his whetstone and began sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scraping filling the cabin. They'd need plenty of firewood before they left. No telling how long the journey might take. Isaac watched him work, his dark eyes following every movement. "Are you taking us to find Mama?" he asked finally. Boone nodded, testing the axe's edge with his thumb. "Reckon she made it to one of the settlements. Probably trying to send help right now. But we can't wait here. Weather's too uncertain." He set aside the axe and moved to inspect his pack saddle. The leather needed some attention where it had gotten wet, and one of the straps was showing wear. As he worked the leather with bear grease, he explained his plan to the boys. "We'll take it slow, follow the valley down. Granger's sure-footed, but the melting snow makes for treacherous going. You boys ever ride before?" Samuel nodded eagerly. "Pa taught us. He was in the cavalry, the 9th. Pride momentarily overcame his grief. "That so?" Boone's hands kept working as he spoke, his movements practiced and efficient. "Well, that'll help. Granger ain't exactly a cavalry mount, but he's steady." The morning passed in necessary labor. Boone chopped enough wood to last several days, showing Isaac how to stack it properly near the door. He checked and repacked his supplies, making sure they had enough jerky and dried beans for the journey. The boys helped where they could, eager for tasks to keep their minds occupied. By midday, the sun had begun its work on the snow. Water dripped from the cabin's eaves, and the pristine white blanket developed a shiny crust. Soon the upper layers would turn to slush, making travel dangerous but not impossible for those who knew the ways of mountain snow. Boone watched the changing conditions through the cabin's single window, mentally mapping their route. They'd need to stick to the ridgelines where possible, avoiding the deeper drifts in the valleys. It would be slow going, but safer than risking the lower paths where melting snow could trap them. "Your mother," he said finally, turning to the boys. "She's a strong woman, going ahead to check that bridge herself." Isaac nodded solemnly. "She always says God gives us strength when we need it most." He paused, then added quietly, "Do you think he'll give her strength now? To wait for us?" Boone felt something shift in his chest, that same stirring of faith he'd felt during the night. "Reckon he will," he said slowly, "and he'll give us strength too to find her." Samuel, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Mama says God sends angels when we need them most." He looked at Boone with complete trust. "Maybe that's why he sent you to find us." Boone busied himself with checking the pack saddle's repairs, uncomfortable with the boys' faith in him. He wasn't an angel, just a broken man who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. And yet, he thought of Mary again, of her belief that everything happened for a purpose. For 10 years he'd rejected that idea, buried it under grief and guilt. But now, looking at these two boys who'd survived against all odds, he wondered if maybe she'd been right after all. The pack saddle was ready. The wood was chopped. Their supplies were organized and secured. All that remained was to wait for the right moment to begin their descent. Boone knew the journey ahead would test them all, but for the first time in years, he felt the stirring of something like hope. It wasn't just about saving two boys anymore. This was about restoration, of a family, of faith, of his own humanity. Somewhere down that mountain, a mother was waiting for her sons. And Jameson Boone, who had spent 10 years hiding from life, had finally chosen to step back into it. 3 days after finding the boys, Boone stood at his cabin door, studying the treacherous conditions. The spring thaw had transformed the pristine snowfall into a hazardous mix of slush and ice. Water trickled beneath the surface, creating invisible pockets that could swallow a man's leg to the knee. The morning sun glinted off the crystalline surface, promising warmth but delivering deception. "Time to get moving," he announced, turning to where Isaac and Samuel huddled near the dying hearth. The past days had strengthened them, though grief still shadowed their eyes. "Got something to show you boys first?" He led them outside to where he'd been working since dawn. A crude sled lay propped against the cabin wall, fashioned from young pine branches he'd stripped and lashed together with leather straps. The boys circled it curiously while Boone explained. "Can't risk both of you on Granger in this mess. Sled'll carry our supplies, and we can take turns riding if needed." He demonstrated how he'd woven strips of rawhide across the branches to create a stable platform. "It ain't pretty, but it'll serve." Isaac ran his hand along the smooth-worn branches. "Like the travois the Indians use," he observed, showing knowledge beyond his years. "That's right." Boone nodded, impressed. "Your pa teach you about that?" "Yes, sir. He learned during the war." Isaac's voice caught slightly at mentioning his father, but he stood straighter, proud of the connection. They loaded the sled carefully, dried beans and meat wrapped in oilcloth, extra blankets, Boone's spare ammunition, and the few belongings they'd salvaged from the boys' wagon. Samuel contributed by tucking his father's worn Bible securely between the blankets, treating it like precious cargo. The sun had climbed higher by the time they set out, Granger in the lead with the sled ropes secured to his harness. Boone took point, testing each step with his walking stick, while Isaac helped Samuel negotiate the slippery terrain. The younger boy's face was set with determination, though Boone could see the effort it took to keep up. Their progress was agonizingly slow. Each step had to be considered, each patch of ground tested before bearing weight. The sled helped stabilize their supplies, but required constant attention to prevent it from sliding sideways on the treacherous slope. Boone found himself reaching back often to steady it, his muscles burning with the effort. By midday, they'd covered barely 2 miles. Boone called a halt beneath a stand of bristlecone pines, their ancient trunks offering some shelter from the wind that had begun to rise. He shared out jerky and hardtack, watching as Samuel's small fingers struggled with the tough meat. "Here," he said gruffly, pulling out his knife to cut it into smaller pieces. The boy's grateful smile stirred something in his chest, a feeling he'd thought long buried with Mary and their infant son. They were negotiating a particularly steep section when disaster nearly struck. Granger's back hoof slipped into one of those hidden snow pockets, and the mule let out a startled bray. The sled began to slide, threatening to pull the animal down with it. "Hold him!" Boone shouted to Samuel, tossing the boy Granger's lead rope. He and Isaac rushed to the sled, throwing their weight against its momentum. Their boots scrabbled for purchase in the slush as they fought to stabilize the load. Isaac proved his worth then, finding the perfect angle to brace himself against a half-buried boulder. Together they managed to steady the sled while Granger found his footing. The whole incident lasted less than a minute, but it left them all shaken. "Good work," Boone said quietly, noting how Isaac's chest swelled at the praise. The boy had his father's strength, no doubt about that. As afternoon waned, the temperature dropped sharply. Boone began looking for suitable shelter, knowing they couldn't risk being exposed after dark. He found it in a deep rock ledge, its overhang creating a natural windbreak. They maneuvered the sled into position, using it to block one side of their makeshift camp. "Gather some wood," he instructed Isaac, "but stay within sight. Samuel, you help me clear this space." Working together, they soon had a serviceable camp. Boone built a small fire, keeping it well under the overhang to minimize smoke. He set their wet boots near the flames to dry and showed the boys how to wrap their feet in spare cloth to prevent frostbite. Dinner was a simple affair of beans and dried meat, warmed in Boone's battered tin pot. The hot food and fire brought color back to the boys' cheeks, and Samuel began to hum softly, something Boone recognized as an old hymn Mary used to sing. Without thinking, he found himself humming along, the familiar tune awakening memories he'd kept locked away for years. Samuel's eyes widened in surprise and delight. "You know Amazing Grace?" he asked, scooting closer to Boone's side. "My wife?" Boone cleared his throat. "She used to sing it." "Where is she now?" Samuel's innocent question hung in the air. "With the Lord," Boone answered simply, surprised to find the words didn't hurt as much as they once had. "Long time ago now?" Samuel nodded sagely, then leaned against Boone's chest, his small body radiating trust. "Mama says that's where Pa is, too. Maybe they're singing together." Boone felt his throat tighten. He looked down at the boy's curly head, now heavy with approaching sleep, and found himself instinctively adjusting the blanket around small shoulders. The gesture felt so natural it startled him. This easy falling into caring for another soul. Isaac watched this exchange from across the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. There was a question in them, one Boone could read clearly. Could they trust this mountain man with their hearts as well as their lives? As if in answer, Samuel mumbled sleepily, "Tell us a story, Mr. Boone." Boone hesitated, then began speaking softly about the mountains, about the ways of elk and eagle, about reading weather in the clouds and finding one's way by stars. He spoke until both boys drifted off, Samuel still pressed against his chest, Isaac curled nearby. The night deepened around their small camp. Boone stayed awake, tending the fire and keeping watch, his thoughts turning to the challenge ahead. Tomorrow they would reach the mining valley, and with it, the town of Silvervale. He'd avoided the settlement for years, trading only with passing trappers and the occasional Ute hunting party. The townspeople called him that wild man in the hills. He'd heard as much from the few travelers who'd stumbled upon his cabin. They didn't trust what they didn't understand, and a man who chose solitude was beyond their understanding. Now, watching the firelight play across the sleeping boys' faces, he wondered how the town would react to their strange party, a mountain recluse bringing in 2 colored children from the high country. He could already imagine the suspicious looks, the whispered judgments. Yet looking down at Samuel's peaceful face, feeling the small weight against his chest, Boone knew there was no turning back. These boys needed their mother, and he would see them safely to her, whatever the cost to his solitary existence. In the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that once would have seemed like companionship enough. Now it just emphasized the precious silence of the sleeping children, the sacred trust they'd placed in him. Dawn found them moving again, working their way down through thinning timber. The air grew noticeably warmer as they lost elevation, and the snow became increasingly patchy. By mid-morning, they caught their first glimpse of smoke rising from the mining valley, thin gray columns reaching up from distant chimneys. Silvervale lay nestled in the valley's embrace, a cluster of wooden buildings and canvas tents sprawled along the creek. The mine head frames stood like skeletal sentinels above the town, their presence a reminder of what had drawn people to this harsh country. Boone felt his shoulders tense at the sight. 10 years of avoiding human contact had left their mark, and now he faced not just contact but scrutiny. He'd have to speak to the sheriff, ask about reports of a colored woman seeking help, face the stares, the questions, the judgment. "Is that where Mama is?" Samuel asked, hope and anxiety mixing in his voice. "We'll find out soon enough," Boone replied, keeping his own concerns hidden. "Stay close now. Trail gets tricky here." The boy nodded, gripping Boone's offered hand as they picked their way down the last stretch of slope. Isaac followed with Granger, showing remarkable skill in managing both mule and sled on the uncertain ground. With each step toward Silvervale, Boone felt the weight of his hermitage pressing against him. He'd built walls around his heart, as solid as any mountain, but these two boys had somehow slipped through. Now those walls would face an even greater test. The smoke grew clearer as they descended, carrying with it the sense of civilization. Wood smoke mixed with coal dust, the sharp tang of metal from the assayer's office, the underlying musk of too many bodies crowded close. Boone breathed deeply, steeling himself for what lay ahead. They were nearly to the valley floor when Samuel stumbled, tired from the long journey. Without hesitation, Boone swept him up onto his shoulders, feeling small fingers grip his hair for balance. The simple trust in that touch gave him strength. Isaac looked up at his brother, then at Boone, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. In that moment, Boone realized that whatever challenges awaited them in Silvervale, these boys had already changed him irrevocably. The wild man of the mountains was becoming something else, something he'd thought forever lost. Whether the town was ready for that change remained to be seen. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silvervale's muddy main street as Boone led their small party toward town. Spring thaw had turned the dirt roads into a treacherous maze of puddles and slick clay. Samuel dozed against Boone's chest in the makeshift sling, while Isaac walked beside Granger, one hand on the mule's flank for balance. The first houses came into view, weather-beaten clapboard with sagging porches and smoke curling from tin chimneys. A woman beating a rug on her porch line stopped mid-swing, her mouth falling open at the sight of them. She hurried inside, and moments later, faces appeared in windows all along the street. Boone kept his eyes forward, ignoring the growing whispers. He'd known this moment would come, had spent the whole journey down preparing himself for it. Still, the weight of so many stairs made his shoulders tense. "Look at that wild man. Those children, are they... What's he doing with them?" The murmurs followed them like ripples in a pond. A group of miners coming off shift halted in their tracks, tobacco juice frozen halfway to the ground. Two women carrying market baskets crossed to the other side of the street, their skirts swishing with barely contained scandal. Samuel stirred against Boone's chest. "Mr. Boone? Why's everyone looking at us?" "Don't mind them," Boone said softly. "We're just here to find your mama." They passed the general store, its wooden sidewalk creaking under the weight of gawking customers. The owner, Mr. Peters, stood in his doorway, wiping his spectacles as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His wife peered around him, one hand pressed to her throat. Isaac walked closer to Boone's side, his young face set in determination, despite the obvious discomfort. The boy had his father's courage, Boone thought, the same quiet dignity he'd seen in the man's final pose, still trying to protect his family even in death. The livery stable lay ahead, and beyond it, the row of wash sheds where the town's laundresses worked. Boone knew this was where they'd find Millie Carter, if she was still in Silvervale. The sound of washboards and women's voices carried on the spring air, mixed with the sharp scent of lye soap. As they approached, conversations died away one by one. Women straightened from their work, staring at the strange procession. Then came a sound that cut through the silence like summer lightning, a scream of pure emotion that made every head turn. Millie Carter stood in the doorway of the nearest shed, her washboard clattering forgotten to the ground. She was a tall woman, straight-backed despite her work, with her hair tied back in a neat cloth. Her eyes were fixed on her sons with an intensity that seemed to erase everything else from existence. "My babies!" she cried, and then she was running, her apron flying behind her like wings. "My babies! My babies!" "Mama!" Samuel wriggled free of the sling as Boone carefully lowered him. Both boys ran to meet their mother, and she fell to her knees in the mud, gathering them into her arms with desperate strength. "Oh, my Lord in heaven," she sobbed, pressing kisses to their faces, their hair, their hands. "My precious boys. I feared." She couldn't finish, overcome by tears of joy. The entire street had gone silent as a church, watching this reunion. Boone stood quietly, letting the family have their moment. He noticed more people gathering, miners from the saloon, shopkeepers leaving their stores, even the preacher emerging from his small church down the way. Then came the sound of boots on wooden planks, and a different kind of silence fell. Sheriff Wade Dugan stepped out of the saloon, his spurs ringing with deliberate slowness. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and hard eyes, his Confederate past evident in his bearing. His right hand rested casually on the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. "Well, well," Dugan drawled, measuring each word. "If it ain't the wild man himself come down from his mountain." His eyes flicked to the reunited family, then back to Boone. "Ain't your kind supposed to stay in the hills, Boone?" The question carried an edge sharp as a knife. Boone met the sheriff's gaze steadily, keeping his voice level despite the tension humming in the air. "These are her sons," he said simply. "I just brought them home." Before Dugan could respond, Millie Carter rose from the mud. Tears still streamed down her face, but there was strength in her bearing as she approached Boone. Without a word, she knelt and took his rough hands in hers, pressing her lips to his frost-scarred knuckles. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Some women turned away, unable to watch this shocking display. A miner spat in the dirt. But Millie Carter didn't seem to notice any of it, her eyes fixed on Boone's weathered face. "You saved my boys," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "When that bridge went out, when Thomas—" Her voice caught on her husband's name, but she pressed on. "I walked for 2 days in the storm, trying to find help. No one would come. But you found them. You brought them back to me." Boone tried to withdraw his hands, uncomfortable with both the attention and the gratitude, but Millie held firm. "The Lord sent you to them," she continued, her faith evident in every word. "And I'll thank him, and you, every day of my life." Sheriff Dugan's face had darkened like a thunderhead. "This ain't proper," he growled. "Ain't natural. A white man involving himself with what, Sheriff?" Millie rose to her full height, though she kept one of Boone's hands clasped in hers. "With saving children from death in the snow, with showing Christian charity when no one else would? Tell me what ain't proper about that." Her words rang out like a challenge. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, many unable to meet her direct gaze. Even Dugan seemed taken aback by her boldness. Samuel, perhaps sensing the tension, pressed himself against Boone's leg. "Mr. Boone sang hymns with us," he announced to no one in particular, "and he made sure we said prayers for Pa when we buried him." This simple statement from a child's lips seemed to change something in the air. The preacher, who had been watching silently, stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. "I was a stranger, and you took me in," he quoted softly. "Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me." He looked at Boone with new consideration. "Perhaps we've been too quick to judge what we don't understand." Dugan's hand hadn't left his gun, but something uncertain had crept into his expression. The crowd waited, breaths held to see what would happen next. In that moment of suspended tension, Isaac spoke up, his young voice steady and clear. "Mr. Boone carried Samuel when he was too tired to walk. He gave us his own coat when we were cold. He's a good man." Out of the mouths of babes, Boone thought, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. He looked down at his hand, still held in Millie's strong grip, and realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in him, but in the very fabric of Silvervale itself. The townsfolk stood witness to this moment, this public display of gratitude that crossed every boundary they'd built between themselves. Some faces showed disgust, others confusion, but here and there Boone could see something else. The first flickering of understanding, of recognition that perhaps their carefully ordered world wasn't as simple as they'd thought. Millie Carter stood proud beside him, her sons pressed close, creating a tableau that would be talked about in Silvervale for years to come. She hadn't let go of his hand, and in that grip was a promise that sometimes grace came in unexpected forms, that courage could wear many faces, and that love knew no color when it came to saving children from a storm. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silvervale's muddy street as Jameson Boone quietly gathered Granger's reins. The reunion's warmth had faded into awkward silence, and townsfolk hurried past, averting their eyes. He'd done what needed doing. The boys were safe with their mother. Time to fade back into the hills where he belonged. He'd barely taken 3 steps toward the livery when Sheriff Dugan's voice cut through the air. "Hold up there, Boone." Boone turned slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. The sheriff approached, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, his boots leaving precise impressions in the mud. "Might want to consider heading straight back to your cabin," Dugan said, his voice pitched to carry to the small crowd still lingering nearby. "Mixing business with their kind, well, it won't sit right with the miners hereabouts. Silvervale's got a certain way of doing things." "Wasn't business," Boone replied quietly. "Was just helping children who needed it." "All the same." Dugan's steel-gray eyes narrowed. "Town's particular about its peace. Be a shame if anything disturbed that." The threat lay there between them, clear as mountain air. Boone nodded once, neither accepting nor challenging, and led Granger toward the general store. He needed supplies, salt especially, having used the last of his preserving the elk meat that had fed the boys. The store's bell chimed as he entered. Old Man Weber stood behind the counter, arms crossed over his flour-dusted apron. The usual friendly greeting was noticeably absent. "Need some salt," Boone said, placing coins on the counter. Weber didn't move. "Fresh out." Boone glanced at the full barrel of salt clearly visible behind the counter. "Reckon that barrel might have..." "Some. That's spoke for." Weber's face had the same hard set as the sheriff's. "Maybe try Gunnison. Heard they're less particular about who they serve." The coins stayed untouched on the counter as Boone walked out. The bell's cheerful ring seemed to mock the sourness churning in his gut. He'd expected some resistance, but this complete rejection struck deeper than he'd like to admit. A commotion drew his attention down the street. A group of miners stumbled out of the saloon, their voices loose with whiskey. Millie Carter was hurrying past with her boys, heads down, trying to make themselves small. One miner, red-faced and swaying, stepped deliberately into their path. "Think you're special now?" he slurred. "Got yourself a white protector?" He hawked and spat, the glob landing at Millie's feet. Samuel whimpered, Isaac's small fists clenched, but Millie kept her dignity, steering her sons around the man without acknowledging him. The other miners laughed, emboldened by her silence. "Now, brothers, let's remember our Christian charity." Reverend Hollis appeared from the church steps, his gentle voice carrying unexpected authority. The young preacher's usual hesitancy was replaced by something firmer as he positioned himself between the miners and Millie's retreating family. "Ain't nothing Christian about this situation," one miner growled. "That mountain man's got no business playing savior to their kind." "The Good Samaritan didn't stop to ask about color before showing mercy," Reverend Hollis replied mildly. "Neither did Mr. Boone when he found those children freezing in the storm." But the tension only grew thicker. More miners emerged from the saloon, drawn by the confrontation. Whispers and dark looks followed Millie until she disappeared around the corner with her boys. Boone watched it all from the shadow of the livery stable. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold, but bringing a different kind of darkness to Silvervale's streets. He'd planned to start back up the pass, but something in his gut told him to wait. These weren't the kind of men who'd let their pride cool overnight. "You'll be wanting a stall for that mule," old Joe, the livery stable hand, said quietly behind him. "Far corner's empty. Might be safer than starting up the pass in the dark." Boone nodded his thanks. He recognized the small kindness for what it was, one of the few he'd received tonight. He led Granger to the indicated stall, spreading fresh hay and checking the mule's hooves for stone bruises from the journey down. The stable settled into night sounds, horses shifting, mice scratching in the hay, wind finding gaps in the wooden walls. Boone sat on a hay bale back against the wall, where he could watch both the main door and the side entrance. He'd slept rough too many years not to recognize when trouble was brewing. The creak of the side door made him tense, but it was Millie Carter who slipped inside, carrying a covered basket. The lamplight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, tied back neat despite the day's trials. "Thought you might be hungry," she said softly, setting the basket down. "It's just cornbread and some beans, but it's hot." "Much obliged," Boone replied, genuine gratitude in his voice. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until the smell of fresh bread reached him. Millie settled on another hay bale, smoothing her skirts with work-roughened hands. "The boys are sleeping now. First real rest they've had since—" She trailed off, pain flickering across her face. "They're strong boys," Boone said. "Done their father proud. Way they looked after each other. Thomas would have thanked you himself if he'd lived." Millie's voice was steady, despite the grief it carried. He always said a man's measure wasn't in his color or his station, but in how he treated those in need. Boone broke the cornbread, offering her half. She accepted, and they ate in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside, voices drifted past, men heading home from the saloon, or perhaps to it. "Had a son myself once," Boone said suddenly, surprising himself. He hadn't spoken of this to anyone in years. "Just a tiny thing. Never even got to hear him cry proper. Fever took him and his mama both while I was ranging for the army." Millie's hand found his in the dim light, strong and warm. "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away," she said softly. but sometimes he gives again, in different ways. Thomas taught our boys that, to look for the giving instead of the taking, to forgive faster than they hate. Wise man. He was, a Buffalo soldier, proud of his uniform and prouder still of his faith. Even when people spat on his service, he'd say, "Can't kill hate with hate, boys. Only love does that." From outside came the sound of boots on packed earth, and men's voices pitched low, meant not to carry but doing so anyway. Run him back to them hills where he belongs, teaching them ideas above their station. After dark, when the sheriff's occupied. Millie's hand tightened on Boone's. "They won't let this rest," she whispered. "Not till they've proved their point." "Ain't proved nothing yet," Boone replied quietly, but he checked his rifle was within easy reach. The hatred in those whispered voices was all too familiar. He'd heard it before, in mining camps and frontier towns where fear turned neighbor against neighbor. "I should go," Millie said, rising. She pulled a warm wool blanket from her basket. "But take this. Nights get cold, even in spring." The blanket smelled of soap and wood smoke, clean and honest as the woman who'd brought it. Boone accepted it with a nod, knowing it was more than just warmth she was offering. It was friendship, freely given despite the cost. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the food, the blanket, everything." Millie paused at the door, her profile strong against the starlight outside. "No, Mr. Boone, thank you. For showing my boys that there's still good men in this world. For proving Thomas right about love being stronger than hate." She slipped out into the night, leaving Boone alone with his thoughts and the muffled sounds of men plotting in the darkness. He wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, settled back against the stable wall, and kept his vigil. Whatever came with the dawn, he'd face it knowing he'd done right by those boys, and maybe, in some small way, right by the son he'd lost so long ago. The night deepened, and with it the whispers of those who thought darkness could hide their plans. But Boone had learned long ago that true darkness lived in men's hearts, not in the honest night. He checked his rifle one more time, and waited, the warmth of Millie's blanket around him like a shield against the hatred gathering outside. Dawn hadn't yet touched the mountains when Jameson Boone woke to the sound of boots on wooden planks. He dozed fitfully in the livery stable, rifle across his knees, but years of frontier living had taught him to wake alert. The footsteps weren't trying to be quiet. They carried purpose. Through gaps in the weathered boards, morning fog rolled thick and gray across Silvervale's muddy street. A group of miners trudged toward the wash shed, led by Burke, the mining foreman. His voice carried sharp and clear through the mist. "Mrs. Carter." Burke's call held fake politeness. "A word, if you please." Boone rose silently, slipping closer to the stable door. He could see Millie already at work, steam rising from her wash tubs as she sorted through miners' clothes. She straightened at Burke's approach, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, Mr. Burke?" "There's been some talk." Burke shifted his weight, trying to look important in his store-bought boots. "About yesterday's incident. Having you wash for the mine? Well, it's become a bad look for business." Millie's spine stiffened. "I've washed these clothes 3 years running, Mr. Burke. Never had complaints before." "That was before you got ideas above your station. Before you let that mountain man make a spectacle." Burke's fake smile vanished. "You're fired. Clear out your things by noon." Boone stepped out of the stable, boots crunching on gravel. "She's done nothing wrong." The miners turned, startled. 2 of Burke's friends, Whitaker and Jensen, moved to flank him. Burke's lip curled. "This ain't your business, Boone. Go back to your hills where you belong." Making an honest woman lose her living over pure spite? Boone's voice stayed level. That's everyone's business. Honest, Whitaker spat. Nothing honest about... Before he could finish, Jensen lunged. His fist caught Boone's jaw, snapping his head back. Whitaker followed with a blow to his ribs. Boone stumbled but didn't raise his hands to fight back. Stop it! Millie's voice cracked like summer lightning. Mr. Boone, please, it's not worth it. Through blurred vision, Boone saw Sheriff Dugan watching from the boardwalk, deliberately looking away. The message was clear. No law would protect them here. Clear out, Burke sneered. Both of you. Boone straightened slowly, tasting blood. He met Millie's eyes and saw the same understanding there. This was only the beginning. The rest of the morning passed in tense silence. Millie finished her last loads of washing while Boone checked his mule and gathered supplies from the mercantile. The shopkeeper overcharged him, but he paid without comment. Better to have what they needed. As the sun climbed toward noon, dark clouds gathered over the mountains. A storm was building, but something uglier than weather brewed in town. Boone felt the weight of hostile stares following his every move. He was loading salt pork into his saddlebags when he heard the crash of breaking glass. A woman's cry split the air. Boone ran toward Millie's small cabin at the edge of town, his bad knee protesting each step. The scene stopped him cold. Every window was shattered. Someone had scattered fireplace ashes across her doorstep, an old threat meaning burn out. Inside, Millie stood amid the wreckage, shielding her boys from the broken glass. Samuel was crying. Isaac's young face had gone hard with anger too old for his years. "Mama," Isaac whispered, "we can't stay here." Millie's hands trembled as she tried to salvage what she could. A quilt her mother had made lay slashed and dirty on the floor. The boys' school books were torn. Their few family photographs had been smashed. Boone stepped carefully through the glass. "Let me help." Together they gathered what could be saved. Clothes, cooking pots, the family Bible, Thomas's cavalry sword. Boone found a trunk that wasn't too damaged and helped Millie pack it. "My cabin," he said quietly when they'd finished. "It's remote, but solid. Room enough for all, at least until things cool down here." Millie hesitated, twisting her apron. "The talk." "Already talking?" Boone said gently. "Can't make it worse, but up there you'd be safe. Boys too." Samuel tugged his mother's skirt. "Please, Mama. Mr. Boone's cabin has rabbits. He showed us." A ghost of a smile touched Millie's lips. "Did he now?" "And a spring that never freezes," Isaac added. "Even in winter." Millie looked around the ruined cabin, her attempt at a respectable home destroyed by hate. Finally, she nodded. "When do we leave?" "Before dawn," Boone said. "Less chance of trouble that way." They spent the night in the livery stable, huddled together in the hay. Old Joe brought them soup and cornbread, along with news that groups of miners were drinking heavy at the saloon, talking ugly about teaching lessons. Hours before sunrise, Boone led Granger to Millie's cabin. They loaded the trunk, tying it secure across the mule's broad back. Millie took one last look at the place she'd tried to make a home, then turned away, shoulders straight and proud. The boys walked close to their mother as they left town, their small feet quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Mist cloaked their departure, but Boone kept his rifle ready. The only sounds were Granger's hooves and the distant cry of an owl. As the trail began to climb, Samuel stumbled, tired. Without a word, Boone lifted him onto Granger's back. The boy's trust squeezed something tight in his chest. How long since small hands had gripped his coat like that? The sun rose as they climbed, painting the clouds pink and gold. Below, Silvervale disappeared into morning shadow. Millie paused to catch her breath, looking back at the town that had rejected them. "My Thomas always said the road to freedom ain't straight," she said softly. "Reckon this is just another bend in it." Boone adjusted Samuel more securely on the mule. "Road gets easier past the switchbacks. Valley opens up nice and green." Isaac, walking beside his mother, squared his small shoulders. "We ain't afraid of hard roads, are we, Mama?" "No, baby." Millie touched her son's head. "We surely ain't." They continued climbing as the morning deepened. Boone watched Millie's determined steps, saw how she hid her weariness from her boys. She'd lost everything: home, livelihood, security, because he'd brought her sons down from the mountain. Yet there was no blame in her eyes when she looked at him, only a quiet strength that humbled him. Near midday, they stopped to rest by a clear stream. While the boys splashed their faces in the cold water, Millie stood beside Boone, both of them looking toward the higher peaks. "You sure about this?" she asked softly. "Taking us in? Could make trouble for you." Boone watched Samuel trying to catch a frog, his brother laughing. "Been alone too long," he said simply. "Maybe it's time for trouble." Millie's hand found his, squeezed once, then let go. They didn't speak again as they resumed their journey, but something had shifted between them. Outcasts together, finding their own kind of freedom on this hard road up the mountain. The trail switched back and forth across the face of the ridge, climbing steadily toward Boone's hidden valley. Behind them, Silvervale and its hatred fell away into distance and memory. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also hope, as fragile and precious as the first spring flowers pushing through mountain snow. Samuel dozed against the trunk strapped to Granger's back. Isaac walked straighter now, his young face set with purpose. And Millie kept climbing, one step at a time, toward whatever future waited in the high country. They were all that was left of their separate families: a widow, her sons, and a lonely mountain man. Cast out by prejudice, drawn together by circumstance. But with each step up the trail, they moved closer to something new, something that might, in time, heal the broken places in all of them. The mountain air tasted sweeter with each step higher into the wilderness. Though the climbing tested their strength, it carried them further from the bitterness they'd left behind in Silvervale. The trail wound through stands of aspen and pine, crossing clear streams that tumbled down from snow-capped peaks. Millie's feet ached in her worn boots, but she pressed on without complaint. Her boys showed more spirit than she'd expected after such a hard journey. Isaac pointed out every deer track they passed, while Samuel rode contentedly on Granger's broad back, singing snippets of hymns to himself. Boone led them steadily upward, stopping often to let them rest. He shared his water skin freely and produced dried apple slices from his coat pocket when the boys grew tired. His quiet thoughtfulness touched Millie deeply. This man who'd saved her children now offered them shelter without asking anything in return. The second morning dawned clear and cool. "Not far now," Boone said as they broke camp. "Valley opens up just past that ridge." He was right. By mid-morning, they crested a gentle rise, and Millie caught her breath at the view. A hidden valley spread before them, cradled by mountains on all sides. A creek threaded through meadows still brown from winter, but showing the first hints of spring green. And there, nestled against a granite outcropping, stood Boone's cabin. "It ain't much," he said gruffly, watching their faces, "but it's solid enough." Samuel bounced on Granger's back. "Look, Mama, a real cabin, just like Mr. Boone said." The cabin was indeed solid, if weather-beaten. Built of thick pine logs, it had a stone chimney and a small covered porch. A lean-to shelter for firewood stood to one side, and Millie spotted what looked like the remains of a vegetable garden near the creek. Inside, the cabin was dim but dry. One main room with a hearth, a rough-hewn table, and 2 rope beds. A ladder led to what appeared to be a sleeping loft above. Everything was neat, but showed signs of long bachelor living. Layers of dust on the windowsills, cobwebs in corners, a few spots where the roof leaked into tin pans. "Boys can have the loft," Boone said, helping Samuel down from the mule. "You take that bed by the hearth, Mrs. Carter. I'll sleep near the door." Millie set down her bundle and squared her shoulders. "First things first, Mr. Boone. This place needs a proper cleaning." He blinked, then the corner of his mouth twitched. "Reckon you're right about that." While Boone unloaded Granger and went to fetch water from the creek, Millie put her boys to work. Isaac swept the floor with a brush broom while Samuel helped her take the bedding outside to air in the sunshine. She found clean rags and began attacking years of dust and grime. By afternoon, the cabin felt transformed. Sunlight streamed through cleaned windows, catching the fresh, swept floor. Millie had found some dried herbs hanging from the rafters and added them to a pot of water on the hearth, filling the air with a pleasant sage smell that covered the musty odors. Outside, she could hear her sons' laughter as they chased chipmunks around the yard. The sound made her heart lighter than it had been in days. Here, at least, they could run free without fear of harsh words or cruel looks. Boone returned with water and stopped in the doorway, taking in the changes. "Place hasn't looked this fine since." He trailed off, and Millie saw a shadow cross his face. "Since your wife?" she asked gently. He nodded once, setting down the water buckets. "Mary. She passed 10 years back. Her and our boy." "I'm sorry?" Millie touched his arm briefly. "Loss leaves deep tracks." "That it does." He cleared his throat. "Spotted some roof leaks need patching. Better tend to those before the next rain." Millie insisted on helping with the repairs. While Boone worked from outside, she climbed into the loft and helped guide patches of split wood shingles into place. They worked well together, moving in quiet understanding, speaking mainly in gestures and nods. The sun was lowering toward the western peaks when they finished. Millie's arms ached from the work, but satisfaction filled her as she watched Boone prepare their evening meal. He moved with practiced ease around the hearth, adding vegetables from his winter stores to a pot of venison stew. The boys came in hungry from their explorations, faces glowing with mountain air and freedom. They washed up without being told and set the table with the few dishes Millie had managed to save from their ruined cabin. Over bowls of rich stew and the last of their journey bread, they shared stories. Boone spoke of his years trapping in these mountains, the best spots for fish, which slopes held the sweetest berries come summer. How to read weather in the clouds that gathered around the peaks. "Caught a grizzly in that meadow once," he said, gesturing with his spoon. "Right where your chipmunks were playing today." Samuel's eyes went wide. "A real grizzly bear? What happened?" "Well, he didn't much care for being caught." Boone's eyes crinkled. "Tore up my best trap and half the meadow besides. Taught me some humility, that bear did." Isaac leaned forward. "Did you shoot him?" "Nah. Figured he'd earned his freedom fair and square. Haven't seen him since, but I still check my back trail when I'm picking berries up that way." Millie smiled at her sons' rapt faces, then shared her own tales of life as a laundress for the 9th Cavalry. She told them about the Buffalo soldiers' pride in their uniforms, how she'd learned to press creases sharp enough to cut paper. She spoke of Thomas, her late husband, and the way he'd taught their boys to hold their heads high no matter what came. "He always said dignity don't come from other folks' opinions," she said softly. "It comes from knowing your own worth in God's eyes." Boone nodded slowly. Wise man, you're Thomas? That he was. Millie looked around the cabin, now clean and warm in the firelight. And I thank God for this borrowed peace he's given us here. After Silvervale, I wasn't sure where we'd find shelter. Stay as long as you need, Boone said. Cabin's better for having folks in it again. Later, as she tucked her boys into their loft bed, Millie heard Boone's deep voice from below. He was praying, uncertain words at first, halting and rough, but growing stronger as he spoke. Lord, he said, it's been a long time since I talked to you proper. Reckon I've been angry about Mary and the baby, but you sent these folks my way for a reason, and I aim to do right by them. Help me remember how to be around people again, and thank you for letting me hear those boys crying in that storm. Amen. Millie's own eyes filled with tears as she added her silent agreement to his prayer. Below, she heard him settle onto his bedroll near the door, his rifle close at hand, a protector's instinct she recognized from her years with Thomas. The cabin creaked gently as it cooled in the mountain night. Through the small window, Millie could see stars scattered like diamond dust across the dark sky. From the creek came the endless murmur of water, steady and peaceful beneath the melting snow. Her boys breathed deeply in sleep, safe at last. On the floor below, Boone's own breathing settled into the rhythm of rest. Millie lay awake a while longer, marveling at the strange paths that had led them here. A widow, her sons, and a lonely mountain man, finding shelter together in this hidden valley. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd first come west with Thomas, full of dreams about their future. But God's grace showed itself in unexpected ways. Sometimes it looked like a bearded stranger carrying your children through a storm. Sometimes it looked like a weather-beaten cabin, made clean and warm again by willing hands. Thank you, Lord, she whispered into the darkness, for this borrowed peace. The creek's song carried her into sleep, its gentle voice promising new beginnings born from hardship's soil. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they rested in the shelter of grace, far above the world's bitter judgment. Morning mist curled around the cabin as the first week of their mountain refuge drew to a close. The days had fallen into a gentle rhythm, each sunrise bringing new lessons in survival and trust. Boone found himself watching the boys discover his world through fresh eyes, their excitement infectious as they learned the ways of mountain life. Isaac proved a quick study with the fishing line. His patient nature served him well as Boone showed him how to read the creek's currents, where trout lurked in the shadows of overhanging rocks. Samuel, though younger, had nimble fingers that were perfect for mending the intricate wire mechanisms of Boone's old traps. Like this? Isaac called out one morning, holding up a string of rainbow trout. Boone nodded, pride warming his chest. Perfect. Your mama will make good use of those. Meanwhile, Millie had discovered the remnants of an old garden plot behind the cabin. Years of neglect had left it wild, but she saw potential in the rich, dark soil. With borrowed tools and determination, she cleared away the weeds and turned the earth, preparing it for the few precious seeds she'd managed to save from their hasty departure. Land's got good memory, she told Boone as she worked. It remembers what it was meant to be, just needs a gentle hand to remind it. He watched her plant rows of beans and squash, her movements sure and hopeful. Something about the way she tended that small plot of earth stirred memories of Mary, who'd once coaxed flowers to bloom in this same soil. The days passed peacefully, marked by small victories and shared meals. Boone found himself speaking more than he had in years, answering the boys' endless questions about mountain life. He taught them to identify animal tracks, to gauge weather from wind direction, to move quietly through the woods. "Why's that bird making that sound?" Samuel would ask, pointing to a jay's warning call. "He's telling everyone there's strangers about," Boone would explain. "Birds make the best lookouts. Smart to listen to what they say." Millie watched these lessons with quiet approval, seeing her sons grow more confident each day. The fear that had shadowed their eyes since the storm began to fade, replaced by the natural curiosity of youth. When Sunday arrived, clear and bright, Millie approached Boone as he split wood near the cabin door. Her hands twisted her apron, betraying nervousness despite her steady voice. "Mr. Boone," she began, "I was wondering if we might hold worship today." The axe paused mid-swing. Boone's shoulders tensed, then slowly lowered. "Been a long time since this cabin heard prayers," he said quietly. "The Lord doesn't mind how long it's been," Millie replied. "He's patient that way." Boone set the axe down, unable to meet her eyes. "Wouldn't know where to start anymore. Lost Mary's hymnal years back, and my own prayers dried up with her." Millie's voice grew softer, gentle as a summer breeze. "Sometimes it helps to start with song." She began to hum, the melody rising pure and clear in the morning air. What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. The familiar tune struck Boone like a physical blow. Mary had sung that hymn nearly every Sunday, her voice filling their cabin with hope even during the hardest times. She'd sung it while rocking their infant son, while mending clothes, while tending her garden. Safe and secure from all alarms, leaning on the everlasting arms. Memories flooded back. Mary's smile, the way she'd squeeze his hand during prayer, her unwavering faith even as fever took her and their boy. The weight of loss, so long buried beneath years of solitude, rose up fresh and raw. "I need to," Boone gestured vaguely toward the woodpile. "Got to fetch more logs." He strode away, his steps unsteady, leaving Millie's song floating in the air behind him. In the shelter of the trees, Boone pressed his forehead against rough bark and fought for breath. Grief and shame warred in his chest. Grief for all the years of silence. Shame for running from the God Mary had loved so faithfully. He stayed there until his breathing steadied, until he could trust himself to return without breaking. When he finally walked back to the cabin, arms loaded with wood he didn't really need, Millie was teaching her boys the words to another hymn. The day passed quietly. Boone kept himself busy with small tasks, checking his trap lines, mending a loose shutter, anything to keep his hands occupied and his mind from dwelling too deep. But he couldn't escape the gentle reminder of faith that Millie's presence had brought back to his home. That evening, after the boys were asleep in the loft, Millie sat by the fire mending one of Samuel's shirts. Boone cleaned his rifle nearby, the familiar motions soothing in their routine. "You know," Millie said softly, not looking up from her stitching, "forgiveness isn't just something we receive. Sometimes it's something we have to give ourselves." Boone's hands stilled on the rifle. "Some things ain't easy to forgive." "No," she agreed. "But God's waiting, Mr. Boone. Been waiting since before the storm that brought us to your door." He didn't answer, focusing instead on the oiled cloth in his hands. But Millie's words settled deep, like seeds in fertile soil. Later, long after Millie had gone to bed, Boone climbed to the highest shelf in his cabin. Behind old traps and hunting gear sat a small wooden box he hadn't opened in 10 years. Dust coated its lid, thick as winter frost. Inside lay Mary's Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of faithful hands. He carried it downstairs with the reverence of a man handling something both precious and dangerous. For a long moment, he simply stood there, feeling the weight of it in his palms. Finally, slowly, he placed it on the table where it would be seen come morning. The sight of it there, in the faint moonlight streaming through the window, made his throat tight with emotion. He didn't open it, wasn't ready for that yet. But as he lay down on his bedroll near the door, Boone found himself remembering more of the words to that old hymn Millie had sung. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms. The question followed him into sleep, echoing with Mary's voice, with Millie's gentle wisdom, with the possibility of grace still waiting after all these years. Through the night, the cabin held its peace, a widow's faith, a mountain man's awakening heart, 2 sleeping boys, and a well-worn Bible finally home again on the table where it belonged. Outside, an early spring wind whispered through pine boughs, carrying the promise of changing seasons and renewed life. The moon traced its path across the sky, casting silver light through the window onto the Bible's cover. Come morning, that light would give way to dawn, and with it, perhaps, the first tentative steps toward healing for a soul too long alone in its grief. The mountain evening settled softly around Boone's cabin as Millie stirred the pot of rabbit stew hanging over the hearth. Samuel and Isaac had spent the afternoon helping Boone repair fence posts, and the work had given them all healthy appetites. The wooden spoons clinked against tin bowls as they gathered for supper, the familiar sounds of shared meals that had become their daily rhythm. Boone noticed Millie seemed distracted, her eyes distant as she served the boys their portions. She'd been quiet all afternoon, carrying something weighty in her expression. After making sure the children had enough to eat, she reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn thin at the creases from repeated handling. "Mr. Boone," she began, her voice careful and measured, "there's something I've been meaning to share with you." She smoothed the paper on her lap, her fingers trembling slightly. "It's about Thomas, my husband." The boys grew still, sensing the importance in their mother's tone. Even the fire seemed to crackle more softly, as if listening. "Most folks assume Thomas died of fever, or in some skirmish gone wrong," Millie continued. "The Army's official report listed it as misconduct." Her voice caught on the word, bitter as medicine. "But that was a lie to cover up what really happened." Boone set down his spoon, giving her his full attention. The lamplight caught the moisture gathering in her eyes. Thomas was stationed near the Ute settlements, serving with the 9th Cavalry. One night, raiders came, not Indians, but white men looking to drive the Utes from their winter hunting grounds. Thomas and his unit were the closest help. She unfolded the letter with reverent care. He died defending those families, died doing what was right, no matter what the Army wrote in their books. Samuel leaned against his mother's arm, while Isaac sat straighter, pride and grief mingling in his young face. Millie drew strength from their presence as she continued. "This was his last letter to me, arrived 3 days after the news of his death." She held the paper closer to the lamplight, its edges soft and worn, dark spots marking where tears had fallen years ago. "There's something in here I think you should hear, Mr. Boone." Her fingers traced the lines as she found the passage she sought. He wrote, "Tell our boys that God puts good people in our path when we need them most. Like that white mountain man named Boone, who saved my life near Fort Garland 2 winters back. Never knew his full name, but I've thanked the Lord for him every day since. He didn't see my uniform or my skin, just saw a man in trouble and did what was right." The spoon slipped from Boone's grip, clattering against his bowl. His mind raced back through the years to a bitter winter day near Fort Garland. He'd found a buffalo soldier trapped under his fallen horse in a ravine, the man's leg crushed and freezing. Together they'd managed to free the horse and splint the soldier's leg. Boone had shared his shelter and provisions for 2 days, until the man could ride again. "I never knew his name," Boone whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "He was hurt bad. We didn't do much talking beyond what was needed. When he was strong enough to ride, we just nodded farewell. Didn't seem important to exchange names back then." Millie's hands trembled as she held the letter. "Thomas said you saved his life. Said he'd never seen a white man treat him with such simple human dignity before that day." The boys stared at Boone with new wonder, connecting this quiet mountain man to the father they'd lost. Isaac spoke first, his voice thick with feeling. "You knew our pa?" "I did, son," Boone replied softly. "Though I didn't know it until now. He was a brave man, refused medicine until his horse was tended to first, kept thanking me, even though thanks weren't needed." Millie pressed the letter to her heart, tears flowing freely now. "All these years, I've carried this letter, reading it to remember his voice. And now here we are, sitting at the table of the very man he wrote about." She looked up at Boone, her eyes shining. "Do you see it, Mr. Boone? How God's hand brought us full circle?" Boone sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of divine providence. The storm that had led him to Samuel and Isaac, the series of events that brought them all to his cabin. None of it seemed like chance anymore. It was as if Thomas Carter's spirit had guided them here, completing a circle of grace started years ago in that winter ravine. "When Thomas wrote about you," Millie continued, "he said something else." She found another passage in the letter. "That mountain man taught me that mercy doesn't see color, it just sees need, like Jesus looking down from the cross, loving us all the same." The words hung in the air like a blessing. Boone remembered the injured soldier's quiet dignity, how they'd shared coffee and hardtack in companionable silence as the winter wind howled outside his lean-to. He'd never thought much about that encounter. It was just what any decent person would do. But now, years later, that simple act of kindness had rippled forward through time, connecting him to this family in ways he never could have imagined. Samuel, who had been quietly absorbing everything, suddenly spoke up. "Mama, does this mean Mr. Boone is like our guardian angel? Since he saved Pa and then saved us too?" Millie smiled through her tears, reaching across the table to touch Boone's weathered hand. "I reckon it means God had a plan bigger than any of us could see. Your Pa's letter was like a map, leading us right where we needed to be." Boone found himself gripping Millie's hand, anchoring himself against the tide of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. All his years of solitude, of running from his grief, had they just been preparing him for this moment? For this family who needed him, who were somehow connected to him through an act of kindness he'd nearly forgotten. "Thomas always said that God works in circles," Millie said softly. "That kindness comes back around, even if we don't see how at first." She carefully refolded the letter, but kept her other hand in Boone's. "When that storm hit us in the pass, I was so afraid. But something told me to trust that God would provide. And he did. He sent us the very man who'd saved Thomas years ago." Isaac stood up suddenly, his young face serious. He walked around the table to Boone's side and did something that startled them all. He hugged him. "Thank you for saving our Pa," he whispered. "And for saving us, too." Boone's arms went around the boy automatically, his throat too tight for words. Samuel joined his brother, and soon Boone held both boys, these sons of a man he'd helped so long ago. He looked over their heads at Millie, seeing in her tear-streaked face the same amazement he felt at God's mysterious ways. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warm light embracing them all. Outside, a whip-poor-will called into the gathering dusk, its song a reminder that even in the wilderness, no soul was truly alone. The letter lay on the table between them, its worn pages containing the thread that had stitched their lives together in this unlikely tapestry of grace. Later, After the boys had gone up to their loft bed, Boone and Millie sat in peaceful silence by the fire. The revelation of their connected past had transformed something between them, deepened their bond from one of circumstance to one of divine purpose. "I've carried that letter everywhere since Thomas died," Millie said finally, reading it to remember not just him, but his faith that good people still existed in this world. She looked at Boone with gentle understanding. "He was right about you." Boone stared into the flames, humbled by the way his simple act of mercy had rippled through the years to bring him this moment of grace. "You're Thomas," he said slowly. "He was a good man, the kind that makes you believe in the goodness of God, even in hard times." "Yes," Millie agreed softly. "Just like you, Mr. Boone. Just like you." The fire settled lower, casting warm shadows on the cabin walls. Through the window, stars emerged one by one in the mountain sky, each one a point of light in the vast darkness. Inside, two souls sat in companionable silence, marveling at the mysterious ways of providence that had brought them together, guided by the words of a fallen soldier who had seen and named the goodness in a stranger's heart. The letter rested on the table between them, its mission finally fulfilled, a message in a bottle across time's ocean, delivering its cargo of truth and connection at last to the exact shore where it was needed most. Word traveled fast in mining country. It rode the supply wagons, whispered through the ease of a general store, and echoed in saloon corners. Within 2 weeks, all of Silvervale knew that the mountain hermit Jameson Boone was sharing his cabin with Millie Carter and her boys. The morning sun cast long shadows across Boone's yard when Reverend Nathan Hollis's messenger arrived with the note. Boone stood at his door, squinting at the cramped handwriting while the young man shifted nervously on his horse. "Reverend says it's important, sir," the messenger said. "Asked for a reply right away." Boone unfolded the paper carefully, his weathered fingers smoothing the creases. The message was simple but clear, an invitation to bring Millie and the boys to Sunday service. The Reverend mentioned putting minds at ease and showing Christian fellowship. Inside the cabin, Millie looked up from her mending. "What does it say?" Boone handed her the note, watching her face as she read. "Reverend wants us all down for service come Sunday." "All of us?" Millie's voice held a mix of hope and hesitation. She hadn't set foot in Silvervale's church since that terrible day they'd fled town. "Says it might help quiet some of the talk." Boone scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Might make things easier for you and the boys in the long run." Millie smoothed her apron, considering. "It would be good for Samuel and Isaac to hear proper preaching again." She paused, looking at Boone. "But are you willing? You haven't been to service since Mary," he finished quietly. "Reckon it's time I stopped running from that too." The messenger was still waiting outside. Boone stepped back out and nodded. "Tell Reverend Hollis we'll come." That evening, after the boys were asleep, Millie and Boone sat planning the journey. It would take most of a day to reach town, even riding double on the mules. They'd need to leave before dawn. "We should take the good quilt for the boys," Millie said, her practical nature taking over. "The nights are still cold." Boone nodded, watching her gather supplies with quiet efficiency. "Millie," he said softly, "you don't have to do this if you're not ready." She straightened, meeting his eyes. "Mr. Boone, I learned long ago that hiding from people's judgment only makes it stronger. Besides," she added with a gentle smile, "the Lord says where 2 or 3 gather in His name, He's there too. Might be some folks need reminding of that." Saturday evening found them preparing clothes and provisions. Millie pressed her best dress and the boys' shirts with the cabin's heavy iron. Boone discovered his old suit coat still fit, though the shoulders were tight. He spent an hour brushing it free of dust while Samuel watched with fascination. "You look different, Mr. Boone," the boy said. "Like a city fellow." Boone chuckled. "Don't reckon I'll ever be that, son, but a man shows respect in the Lord's house." They set out before sunrise Sunday morning, the eastern sky just beginning to pale. Boone led the way on his steadiest mule, with Isaac riding behind him. Millie and Samuel followed on the other mule, their good clothes wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and early summer flowers. The descent took longer than the climb had. Boone chose the gentlest trails, avoiding the steeper paths that might frighten the boys. They stopped at noon to rest the mules and eat the cornbread Millie had packed. The valley spread below them, Silvervale's church spire visible in the distance. "Mama," Samuel asked, "will people be mad we're coming?" Millie pulled him close. "Some might be, sugar, but that's their burden to carry, not ours. We're going to worship God, same as them." The sun was well past its peak when they finally reached town. Dust coated their clothes despite their care, and their backs ached from hours of riding. But Millie sat straight and proud on her mule, and Boone found himself unconsciously matching her dignity. Their arrival didn't go unnoticed. Townsfolk paused on their porches and storefronts, watching the unlikely family make their way toward the church. Boone helped Millie and the boys dismount near the hitching post, then tied the mules securely. Reverend Hollis met them at the church steps, his kind face creased with welcome. "Brother Boone, Sister Carter, I'm glad you came." He bent to greet the boys at their eye level. "And these fine young men must be Samuel and Isaac." The boys ducked their heads shyly, but smiled at the preacher's warmth. Inside, the church was already filling with the usual Sunday crowd. Conversations stuttered to silence as Boone led his makeshift family down the aisle. He chose a pew near the middle, not hiding in the back, but not presuming to sit up front either. The whispers started immediately. "Bold as brass," someone muttered. "Ain't natural," came another voice. But others simply watched with curiosity or, in a few cases, quiet approval. Millie pulled her worn Bible from her bag, sharing it with the boys. Boone sat stiffly in his old suit coat, feeling every eye upon them. But then Millie opened to Isaiah and pointed to a passage. "Would you read this later?" she whispered, "when the Reverend calls for scripture?" Boone nodded, though his throat felt dry at the thought. He hadn't read aloud in church since before Mary died. The service began with a familiar hymn. Millie's clear alto rose above the uncertain congregation, steady and true. The boys joined in, their young voices carrying the melody with the pure confidence of children who knew they were loved. Gradually, other voices strengthened around them until the small church filled with sound. When time came for scripture reading, Reverend Hollis looked directly at Boone. "Brother Jameson, would you share God's word with us today?" The church grew silent as Boone stood, Isaiah's words before him. His voice, though rough from years of disuse, carried clearly through the quiet space. "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea." The words seemed to hang in the air after he finished. Boone sat down, aware of the stillness around him. Then Samuel and Isaac stood up together, just as they'd practiced at the cabin, and began to sing "Amazing Grace." Their sweet, clear voices filled the rafters, carrying all the innocence and hope of childhood. More than one hand wiped away tears as the boys sang. Even those who had frowned at their entrance found themselves moved by the simple beauty of children's faith. When the boys finished, there was a moment of profound silence before the congregation burst into heartfelt amens. After the service, people filed past with cautious nods. Some still turned away, but others stopped to speak. Mrs. Anderson, the miner's wife who had lost 2 children to fever last winter, pressed a warm loaf of bread into Millie's hands. "Fresh baked this morning," she whispered. "Children need good bread to grow strong." Millie's eyes filled with tears at this small kindness. "Thank you, sister," she said softly. Mrs. Anderson squeezed her hand before hurrying away. Reverend Hollis found them as they prepared to leave. "You've done a brave thing today," he told them. "Sometimes it takes more courage to extend a hand than to make a fist." Boone helped Millie and the boys mount their mules for the long ride home. The sun was already low, painting the valley in gold and purple shadows. As they started up the trail, Millie looked back at the church, its white spire catching the last light. "Well," she said quietly, "that's a beginning." Boone nodded, feeling something shift in his heart, like a door long rusted shut, finally creaking open. The boys chattered about the service, their voices bright with excitement. Around them, the evening air filled with the song of crickets and the distant call of a whip-poor-will, nature's own hymn of praise. They rode home under a sky turning to stars, 4 souls bound together by something stronger than circumstance, the quiet certainty that love, like grace, could bridge any distance and heal any heart willing to receive it. The following Sunday brought scorching heat to Silvervale. Boone sat with Isaac and Samuel in the church parsonage, while Millie finished her morning shift at the laundry shed. The boys were drawing Bible scenes with charcoal when shouts erupted from the mining camp. "Fire! Fire at the fuel shed!" Through the window, Boone saw thick black smoke billowing skyward. His heart stopped when he realized the flames were racing toward the laundry building where Millie worked. Without hesitation, he sprinted outside, the boys close on his heels despite his warnings to stay put. The scene at the mining camp was chaos. Men scrambled with water buckets while women grabbed children and fled. The dry wooden buildings caught like kindling. Then Boone heard it, screams from inside the burning laundry shed. "Mama!" Isaac shouted, darting forward with Samuel right behind him. Before Boone could grab them, they disappeared into the smoke-filled doorway. "No!" Boone charged after them. Heat seared his lungs as he crashed through a broken window, cutting his palms on jagged glass. Smoke stung his eyes, but he could hear the boys coughing somewhere ahead. "Isaac! Samuel!" He found them huddled beneath a wash table, choking on the thick air. Gathering both in his arms, Boone staggered toward the exit. The roof groaned overhead. They burst outside just as burning timbers crashed down behind them. Boone collapsed in the dirt. The boys clutched to his chest. As he lay there coughing, a crowd gathered around them. Millie pushed through, sobbing with relief to find her sons alive. But then an angry voice cut through the chaos. "He said it to drive us out." The mob's mood turned dark. Faces that moments ago had shown concern now twisted with suspicion and hate. They pressed closer, fists clenching, as Boone struggled to his feet. The mob surged forward, rough hands grabbing Boone's arms. He didn't resist as they dragged him through the muddy street towards the courthouse. His cut palms left bloody smears on his shirt, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hatred in their eyes. Sheriff Dugan stood on the courthouse porch, a coil of rope in his hands. The miners shouted for frontier justice, their faces flickering in the orange glow of the burning buildings. With practiced motions, Dugan threw the rope over a heavy wooden beam. "Please, brothers and sisters," Reverend Hollis raised his hands, his voice trembling. "Let's not act in haste." But the crowd drowned him out, their anger drowning his weak protests. Through the chaos came Millie's voice, strong and clear. She pushed through the mob, clutching a worn piece of paper in her hands. Isaac and Samuel clung to her skirts, tears streaming down their soot-stained faces. "Uncle James!" Samuel cried out. "Don't hurt him!" Fine raindrops began to fall, hissing as they struck the hot coals of the ruined laundry shed. Millie unfolded the letter with shaking hands and lifted her chin. "My dearest Millie," she read, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. "I write to tell you of a white mountain man named Boone who saved my life near Fort Garland." The words of her dead husband, Sergeant Thomas Carter, rang out in the rain-cooled air. As she read of Boone's courage and compassion, Sheriff Dugan's eyes dropped to the ground. The rope hung limp in his hands. Reverend Hollis finally found his courage. He stepped forward and cut the rope with his pocket knife. "If this man burns," he declared, "the town burns with him." The rain grew heavier, drumming against the courthouse roof. One by one, the townspeople stepped back, their anger washing away with the downpour. The flames that had threatened to consume the mining camp sizzled and died in the deluge, sending up ghostly wisps of steam. Sheriff Dugan tucked the rope into his coat, shame written across his weathered face. Several miners who had been shouting the loudest now helped Reverend Hollis, and 2 shopkeepers carry Boone's limp form toward the parsonage. His cuts left crimson trails in the rain. Inside the warm parlor, Millie tended to Boone's wounds with gentle hands. Isaac brought clean water while Samuel held the lamp, their voices joining in a quiet spiritual they'd learned at their mother's knee. The familiar melody filled the small room as Millie cleaned and bandaged Boone's damaged palms. Near midnight, Boone's eyes fluttered open. "I saw Mary," he whispered, his voice rough from smoke. "She said it's not my time." Millie squeezed his uninjured fingers and bowed her head, praying over him until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. Morning brought a changed valley. The air smelled of wet ash and fresh rain, like God himself had cleansed the land. Reverend Hollis stood on his porch, watching the sun rise over the blackened remains of the laundry shed. His voice was firm as he addressed the gathering townspeople. "We will rebuild," he declared, "not as separate peoples, but together, white and colored hands working side by side, as God intended." He looked at Millie and her boys, then at Boone's sleeping form through the window. "This is how we make things right." The rain had washed away more than just the fire's remnants. It had cleansed hearts, too, leaving room for mercy to take root and grow. The mountain summer bloomed golden and sweet as healing settled over Silvervale. Jameson Boone took careful steps with his cane along the newly laid boards of the laundry shed, his wounds mostly mended but still tender. The building stood twice as large now, with windows that caught the morning light. "Uncle James," Isaac called from the woodpile, his small hands wrapped around a piece of pine. "Is this one good for whittling?" Boone smiled, examining the wood. "Reckon so. Mind the grain when you cut." Inside the shed, Millie hummed as she worked the washboard, her strong voice carrying over the splash of water. Samuel sat cross-legged nearby, sounding out words from a primer as his mother gently corrected him. The boy's finger traced each letter with determination. Miners brought their dirty clothes and left with clean ones. Ute traders exchanged fresh hides for washing services. Settlers stopped by with torn gear for mending. No one turned away empty-handed, and no one questioned who did the work. On Sunday, the whole valley gathered for the church dedication. Reverend Hollis stood proud before the fresh-painted doors. When Millie stepped forward to sing, her voice rose pure and strong, filling every corner of the sanctuary. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." The congregation sat still as stone, heads bowed. Some wiped tears. Even the sheriff removed his hat, holding it, against his chest. Boone closed his eyes, feeling the hymn wash over him. The peace he'd found wasn't the lonely quiet of his mountain exile, but something richer, the peace of belonging, of purpose restored. He opened his eyes to find Samuel leaning against his leg, Isaac standing tall beside him, and Millie's voice soaring toward heaven. Through grace, they had built something stronger than shame. Through faith, they had found their way home. The summer morning dawned clear and bright over the valley. Jameson Boone worked steadily at mending the split-rail fence near the creek, his weathered hands moving with practiced care. The sound of splashing water and Millie's gentle humming drifted from the wash line, where white sheets billowed like sails in the mountain breeze. Isaac and Samuel chased each other around Old Granger, the mule watching their antics with patient eyes. Their laughter echoed off the ridge, pure and unrestrained. "Don't tire him out too much," Boone called, smiling. "Still need him to haul water later." Pausing to wipe his brow, Boone leaned against a fence post. Sunlight filtered through the hanging laundry, casting dancing shadows on the grass. The sight caught him unexpectedly. Sheets on a line, children at play, a woman's song carrying on the wind. His chest tightened with emotion as realization washed over him. This was family. What he'd thought lost forever had found him again, here in this valley. Millie finished pinning the last sheet and walked over, her dark eyes warm with understanding. She stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching, watching the boys play. The morning sun painted everything in soft gold. From down in Silvervale, church bells began to ring, their clear tones floating up the mountainside. Without a word, both Boone and Millie bowed their heads. The boys stopped their game, coming to stand close. "Lord," Boone whispered, his voice rough with gratitude, "thank you for second chances, and for mercy that don't care what color a man is." They knelt together in the sweet summer grass, hands joined in a circle. Millie's fingers were strong and sure in his calloused grip. The boys giggled as Granger snuffled at Samuel's hair, and their laughter rose pure and clean, mixing with the sound of rushing water and distant hymn bells carrying up from the valley below. In that moment, grace was complete. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.